The UN's top court is holding hearings today over new emergency measures sought by South Africa to stop Israel's attacks on Rafah. The International Court of Justice convened to hear a case filed by South Africa accusing Israel of stepping up what it called a genocide in Gaza. It's urging the court to order a halt to Israel's assault on Rafah. South Africa's legal team are presenting their case today, and Israel will speak tomorrow. The hearings are part of a broader case against Israel. And they've been taking place as Israeli forces pushed into Rafah, where many of Gaza's displaced people have been sheltering.
Rafah in southern Gaza, a shelter for more than 1 million Palestinians. And now the focus of Israel's military assault as troops push into the city. Displaced Palestinians flee again, while their allies abroad hope to prevent further disaster. South Africa has petitioned the International Court of Justice for Israel to immediately withdraw from Rafah and cease its military offensive. It also asks Israel to take all effective measures to facilitate unimpeded access to aid. These measures are part of an ongoing case filed by South Africa that accuses Israel of violating the Genocide Convention. An interim ruling in January stopped short of calling for a ceasefire, but the court did state that there was a real and imminent risk under the convention and demanded provisional measures from Israel to prevent genocide.
Israel must, in accordance with its obligations under the Genocide Convention, in relation to Palestinians in Gaza, take all measures within its power to prevent the commission of all acts within the scope of Article 2 of the Convention.
Israel has said it is acting in accordance with international law and has called the genocide case baseless. The hearings taking place this week will focus on emergency measures only. South Africa will present its side first. The country has a long history of solidarity with Palestinians. Its leaders have drawn comparisons between the situation in Israel and the Palestinian territories and that of South Africa's former apartheid system. A ruling on the broader genocide case will likely take years. ICJ rulings are binding, but the court has no way to enforce them.
Where is the International Court of Justice? Can everyone only talk about aid? We don't want aid. We want a permanent ceasefire and a full withdrawal from Gaza. Gaza has been destroyed and Rafah is not safe. Gaza as a whole is not safe.
Any ruling in South Africa's favour will, however, compound international pressure on Israel at a time when Israeli leadership is increasingly isolated over its war in Gaza.
Our correspondent Bernd Riegert has been following these hearings for us. Bernd, what arguments did South Africa put forward today?
It's already the third time that South Africa is appealing to the court to come up with new interim measures or provisional measures against Israel in this genocide case. South Africa is arguing that Israel is intensifying its shelling and bombardments in Gaza and is also now on the ground in Rafah, and that the population in Gaza is willingly starved to death by Israel, and therefore the South African party wants the court to step up its efforts to keep Israel, to prevent this, what they call a genocide. So the court should order an immediate ceasefire and a withdrawal of Israeli troops from Gaza, or at least Rafah. Let's listen to the lead counsel of South Africa, Vusi Musi Mandozela.
Sadly, South Africa is yet again compelled to return to this court in recognition of its obligation under the Genocide Convention, due to the continuing annihilation of the Palestinian people, with over 35,000 now killed and most of Gaza reduced to rubble. Despite the short notice of this oral hearing, South Africa has traveled here today to do what it can to urgently stop the ongoing genocide, the gravity of the attacks requiring urgent and speedy proceedings to preserve the rights of the Palestinian people, a commitment which South Africa takes seriously.
All right, we heard the South African Council there. Bernd, what are the next steps now?
Well, South Africa is making its case today, and tomorrow the court will hear arguments from Israel, the rebuttal from the Israeli side. And Israel will, of course, also point to the fact that Hamas, which is seen as a terrorist organization in the EU by Israel and the United States and others, that Hamas is also part of this whole thing on the ground there. South Africa did not mention Hamas so far. Israel is arguing as soon as Hamas stops its resistance and its fighting, then the war would be over. And Israel has no intention actually to kill the Palestinian people. And Israel is also rebutting that there is a genocide going on. So we will hear that tomorrow. After that, the court then will decide maybe in 1 or 2 weeks if the interim or provisional measures are granted. And the general case about the genocide, that will take years until a verdict will be handed down.
So if the ICJ were to grant this emergency request brought in by South Africa, how powerful would it be? Because ICJ rulings are binding, but the court has no way to enforce them.
Yeah, the rulings are binding, but they don't have much effect on the ground, as you can see now in this war of Israel against the Hamas, because Israel is just ignoring what the court says. And the main problem for the court is there is no police force or something in the world that can force either side to follow the rulings of the court. So it's a moral and a political pressure, but very difficult to set that in motion on the ground, really.
Well, South Africa's ambassador to the Netherlands urged the World Court to order a halt to Israel's assault on Rafah. The city in southern Gaza has been sheltering many of the displaced Gazans.
Sadly, South Africa is yet again compelled to return to this court in recognition of its obligation under the Genocide Convention, due to the continuing annihilation of the Palestinian people, with over 35,000 now killed and most of Gaza reduced to rubble. Despite the short notice of this oral hearing, South Africa has traveled here today to do what it can to urgently stop the ongoing genocide, the gravity of the attacks requiring urgent and speedy proceedings to preserve the rights of the Palestinian people, a commitment which South Africa takes seriously.
Well, I'm joined now by our correspondent, Rosie Brichard. She's been following the hearings for us. Rosie, walk us through the main arguments that were put forward today by South Africa.
Well, South Africa is back in the court. It's not the first time we've been here, but what South Africa is saying is that Israel's actions in Rafah not only amount to a significant escalation, but they say a real change in facts on the ground, which South Africa is arguing is a real danger to Palestinians as a group in Gaza, to the health system in Gaza, to children. And the way they made those arguments, we saw lawyers, for example, showing pictures of the destruction in Gaza, much of the strip, of course, really reduced to rubble. And I think one moment that really stood out to me, Brent, was one of the South African lawyers really struggling to hold back tears as she talked particularly about the plight of children in Gaza. Now, South Africa has asked the court to come with emergency orders, asking Israel to, or demanding that Israel immediately and unconditionally withdraw from Gaza. It's also asking that the court demand Israel allows unimpeded access for humanitarian workers, for the UN and for journalists.
Do we know what the next step is for this case?
Well, the very next step is that Israel will get to come forward and mount its own arguments. And in the past, Israel has dismissed, rejected South Africa's case as baseless blood libel. And in fact, Israel's even gone farther than that and said that it believes that South Africa is really acting as the legal wing of Hamas here. South Africa is a country which traditionally is close to the Palestinian cause. Israel will likely go on in its arguments to say that it is responding legitimately, it believes, to the Hamas terror attacks of October 7th. Israel will likely argue that it does everything it can to protect civilians, that it's not targeting civilians, that it is in fact targeting Hamas militants. And then it will be up to the court to deliberate, and it will likely take a couple of weeks over whether to respond to South Africa's request for emergency measures. But the bigger case here, Brent, over whether there has in fact been a breach of the Genocide Convention, well, that will take years.
And if the court were to say yes to South Africa's request for ordering these emergency measures, a stop to what is going on in Gaza, I mean, would it be enforceable? Is there any teeth here?
The court itself, the UN's top court, doesn't have any enforcement mechanism. If you want any proof of the limits of its power, just recall back in early 2022, the court ordered that Russia stop its full-scale invasion of Ukraine. Well, we know that that certainly has not happened. But what I think South Africa is aiming at here, and what certainly does seem to be the case, is that this case where we see Israel in the Hague, it really piles more international pressure on Israel over this ongoing humanitarian crisis in Gaza. And I think that comes specifically at a time where Israel's relations with its allies here in Europe, for example, but also in the United States, are particularly strained, and particularly in light of the ongoing situation in Rafah, which the EU, for example, has clearly warned Israel against in the past, against mounting any sort of full-scale assault there.
DW's Rosie Brichard with the latest tonight from Brussels. Rosie, as always, thank you.